Have you ever watched someone blow up a balloon until it popped? That's exactly what an autistic meltdown feels like to me. It's the sense that I'm being filled to the brim and I'm about to explode, and then I do explode. And in this video, we're going to cover those signs and causes of an autistic meltdown, where an autistic person is feeling so overwhelmed they just can't anymore. And at the end of the video, I'm going to share one bonus critical tip for you to use if you ever encounter someone who is having an autistic meltdown and you want to help them. So let's start with a basic definition. A basic definition of an autistic meltdown is an involuntary reaction to too much stress and to too much sensory input. So think of our five senses: taste, smell, touch, hearing, and sight. Autistic people process that information differently, and it can often be overwhelming for our brains to process too much of it. And that is when a meltdown occurs, when we have too much input that our brain can no longer process. And so think of that balloon. That balloon, slowly it starts getting filled with stress and sensory input. And as more stress and more sensory input is put into that balloon, it expands and expands until it cannot anymore and it explodes. So what are some of the signs and characteristics of an autistic meltdown? The first, of course, is kind of the emotional state of the individual having a meltdown, that there is increased frustration, anger, anxiety, and that often might look like lashing out. Other things it can look like is starting to cry or wanting to run away from the situation, or actually running away from the situation. You also might think of people who are lying on the floor or banging their hands on something, and this can be where some really harmful behaviors kick in, especially self-harm. An autistic person having a meltdown might hit their leg, hit their head, hit their arm, or hit their wall until they actually hurt themselves. Also, during these meltdowns, it can be very difficult for people to process what is going on. It can also result in kind of helplessness, right? There's so much input coming in, we cannot process it, and it might just feel like too much, too overwhelming. And that can actually lead to things like suicidal ideation if the person is so overwhelmed with the situation. So when a meltdown happens, it is this kind of big deal. It's this big moment of letting out a bunch of excess emotion, a lot of excess sensory input. And so a lot of times it maybe is more helpful to think of what are some of the signs that lead into this meltdown. And so a few things that might be signs that a meltdown is coming is first, increased stimming. If someone starts to increase their stimming, again, that's that behavior of repetition, that self-soothing behavior, and I'll have a link below to that, right? If someone is starting to have more and more stimming behaviors, that is a sign that their body is becoming more and more overwhelmed, and that can be the first sign of a meltdown. The next thing that can be a sign of a meltdown is changes in breathing. Because meltdowns involve that excess stress or excess sensory overload, our breathing can quicken, right? We can start breathing more shallowly, more quickly. So check our breath and our breathing as we are thinking about whether or not a meltdown might be occurring. Related to one of the actual signs a meltdown is happening, having a desire to leave a situation or getting out of a situation is often a sign that a meltdown is about to occur, especially if it feels not voluntary, right? I have to leave now. I must leave. It's not my choice. That can be a sign a meltdown is on the way. And finally, increased irritability and restlessness. As we are starting to get all of this input, we can become irritable when we get more and more input. And so think of that balloon, right? As it expands, we might become more and more irritable as we continue to be pushed to expand or have more sensory input. And so that's a little bit about meltdowns. Now, if you want to help someone who is having a meltdown, you must follow this first key piece of advice. And the first piece of advice is to not add additional sensory inputs. Initially, right, we might think it's important for us to say something to the effect of, "You're okay, it's all right, don't worry about it." Or even like give someone a hug or a touch to kind of comfort them in that moment. But that is actually the opposite of what you should be doing. You should not be adding in additional sensory input, such as touch or right hearing, as they have to hear you say it's all right. And so instead of trying to calm them in that exact moment, we need to be doing other things to help them. And that is exactly what my next video on how to help someone having a meltdown is all about. So please check that out. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.